Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 22nd day of March in the year 2017. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Let me open today by apologizing for yesterday. We had to stop the program about 10 minutes in because we were having problems with Skype. And there were huge gaps in the program. And in fact, I had a conversation with my brother last night, and he said that it was impossible to follow because of the huge gaps that were occurring. So Skype was malfunctioning, and we couldn't get it to go. So we had to curtail the program rather than go through a program that nobody could understand or anything. We didn't do that. So I apologize for that. But we're persistent, and here we are on the very next day, the 22nd, Wednesday, and we're scheduled for 2 hours of broadcast today. And with everything, if everything goes right and the planets are lined up as they should be, we'll hopefully get today's program in. I do really encourage you to take advantage of the direct line we have, the phone line, which would get you on the air so that you can share your thoughts on some of these issues. Today, I really see a couple of major issues comprising the program today. One of them will be focused on health care. I think both of them. The other one, it's about an article that I read a few weeks ago that I've been looking for an opportunity to share with you. I just think it's one of those pieces you come across every once in a while where you remember several weeks ago now, we did a program about art and the importance of art in terms of reflecting agony and the ability of art to ultimately cause people to actually experience other people's pain, for example. And we talked about that because it's one of those rare pieces, and the one I have today is quite similar to that. But let me first of all make sure that you have our phone number, and if you are inclined at any point during the program to offer a thought or a comment, by all means feel free to do that. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to share your thoughts with me one-on-one in an email, I would welcome that, and I'll do the very best I can to get your thoughts and your ideas on the air for our listeners so that they can benefit from your idea or your thought as well. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And finally, I do encourage you to check out our Facebook page. If you're a regular user of Facebook, you know how easy that is. Just go to the homepage, facebook.com. And in the search box at the top, if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be onto our Facebook page, and there are a number of postings there. The most recent one you'll come across will be first. And in fact, one of the issues we'll be dealing with today, which is healthcare, is actually reflected in one of those postings on our Facebook page. I put it on there over the weekend. This was the issue I thought we would get to yesterday, and because of the technical problems with Skype, we weren't able to do it. But again, healthcare is one of those issues that doesn't become outdated because you wait a day or two. Healthcare continues to be at the forefront of everybody's conversation and discussion, including what's happening in Washington right now. As you know, there's a vote. The Republicans in the House are scheduled to vote on the healthcare alternative that they have developed to the Affordable Care Act. And now the issue is one of counting votes. What I heard last I heard this morning, the media is basically saying that there are a number, I believe 27 House members, Republicans, who claim that they are not going to support the bill as it's currently written. And if the Democrats hold fast to their opposition, then that will kill the legislation. And as you may recall, President Trump visited Capitol Hill the other morning, Monday morning, and in closed-door meeting with Republicans, made it very clear that if they don't vote for this bill, then their reelection in 2018 could be in jeopardy, as well as the House majority that they currently enjoy. So again, healthcare remains at the forefront of everybody's conversation and discussion and concern. I had breakfast with a friend this morning, and sure enough, that was one of the topics we discussed. My friend and I are on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what we think about government managed healthcare, government generated healthcare. And talked about the fact of faceless bureaucrats making healthcare decisions for us, and whether in fact the nature of this society suggests that those are decisions we have a right to make for ourselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the basis of our discussion. I spent quite a bit of time yesterday, and I think I made reference to it in the short time we were on the air yesterday, listening to the confirmation hearings for Neil Gorsuch to take the place of the deceased Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court. And I found an awful lot of the testimony and a lot of the back and forth with members of the Senate Judiciary Committee extremely enlightening and extremely informative. And it so happens I came across an article, and I won't take that much time with this morning, but I thought it was significant enough that I would call it to your attention, since the Gorsuch nomination is still on the table. It's still ongoing. For those of you who've been following the media this morning, there's a terrorist incident of some kind going on in London, and most of the media is focused on that as they try to piece together the story of exactly what's happening there. But the fact of the matter is, Judge Gorsuch is back on the Hill today, facing another day of questions from the Judiciary Committee. And I thought that I would tune in on that this morning, but of course with the situation going on in London, that was taking most of the media attention. But there was an article in this morning's New York Times, and the author of the article is Ken Levy. Ken Levy teaches law at Louisiana State University at LSU. And his article, his op-ed piece, is prefaced by comments made by Senator Dianne Feinstein of California at Monday's confirmation hearing for Neil Gorsuch. And basically, Senator Feinstein basically made the statement that Judge Gorsuch's originalist judicial philosophy she finds to be really troubling. And Ken Levy uses that as an introduction to his article because he claims that indeed this idea of originalist judicial philosophy is troubling and then he takes on the issue of originalism. We spent quite a bit of time on this, and of course we focused on it for the most part when before Justice Scalia passed last February. We spent quite a bit of time on the idea of originalism in terms of interpreting the Constitution as opposed to the idea of the living Constitution. It's really the premise or the perspective that Ken Levy, Professor Levy, uses in his piece this morning as well. Basically, his piece is a justification for the idea of a living Constitution. We've talked about this before. I've made my own position on it quite clear. I have endorsed, I believe, and I continue to believe, that the idea of a living Constitution is really the substance or the basis for the longevity and the continued relevance of the U.S. Constitution. This program, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, is based on the idea as to what the Constitution is all about. And that's really the role of the court, as Justice Marshall said, to determine or to say what the law is. Justice Gorsuch, in his testimony yesterday, made it very clear that he sees his role as a judge in applying the Constitution. And a number of the questions at yesterday's hearing were focused principally on previous decisions that Justice Gorsuch made. And of course, Republicans are very supportive of the fact that Judge Gorsuch tends to come down most often on the conservative side in his decisions, and basically made the statement yesterday that he's extremely committed to the idea of originalism. In fact, in response to one questioner, and I believe it was Al Franken, Senator Franken of Minnesota, but I could be wrong there. But Judge Gorsuch made the point that every judge is in a way an originalist, because no judge worthy of the name would render a decision that involves interpretation of the Constitution without at least considering the original intent, the original meaning of the particular place in the Constitution, which is relevant to that particular case or that particular issue. His argument is every judge, in rendering a decision, takes into consideration the original intent or the original meaning of the particular phrase or clause of the Constitution that seems to be most appropriate. In Levy's article this morning, he makes the point that originalism by itself is incomplete, that in reality, one must consider originalism in combination with the idea of textualism. Those of you who remember and have focused on some of the decisions written, opinions written by Justice Scalia, will recognize or recall that Justice Scalia was a big fan of textualism. His basic argument is that the courts, in interpreting the Constitution, must be driven, must be guided by the text, by what the words say in the Constitution. And so the way that Levy puts together the ideas of originalism and textualism, I think is very interesting. Basically, textualism says that in interpreting the Constitution, judges should be guided, should confine themselves to the words of the Constitution. And Justice Scalia used to say that frequently. If you remember, we spent quite a bit of time on the Heller decision on the right to bear arms. Justice Scalia wrote the majority opinion in that case. And he makes the point in that case that in interpreting the Second Amendment, it is critical that we look at the text, that we be guided by the text. So textualism then is an acknowledgement by judges, by courts, that the text should guide one in understanding the words of the Constitution. Originalism says that if and when the words are not all that clear, if the words are ambiguous and it's a little bit difficult to determine the precise meaning of the words, then judges, according to originalism, need to consult the historical sources to determine the meaning of those words at the time that the Constitution was ratified. In other words, what did those who wrote and voted on the particular words in question, how did they understand the meaning of the words at that time? That's originalism. So it's a combination of the words themselves in conjunction with the meaning of the words at the time that the Constitution was ratified. Those who voted for or against the Constitution did so because they attributed or assigned specific meaning to particular words. And originalists believe that if the words are at all ambiguous, are not clear, then courts must be guided by the meaning of those words at the time that the Constitution was drafted, because that's the only way you can get at the original intent of the founders. Levy quotes Justice Scalia, who was a big advocate of this, and said Justice Scalia made the point that if judges are not bound by words and by history, then they will drift into exceeding their legitimate authority as judges and become activists or super legislators. Because if they are not guided by the words or by the original intent of the words, then that gives them license to make the Constitution say whatever they want it to say. In other words, if you are not guided by originalism and textualism, then that leaves judges too free to assign their own meaning to the Constitution. In other words, they become judicial activists. They become lawmakers rather than interpreters of the law. In other words, they violate their role as judges. Here's the issue, according to Professor Levy. If you read the Constitution, there are a number of words in the Constitution which are, to say the very least, ambiguous. They're a little bit hard to pin down. They're vague. They're flexible. Their meaning is not precise. What are those words? The use of words like unreasonable. Remember in the Bill of Rights, unreasonable search and seizure. Right, the very word right itself. What does that mean, a right? Probable cause, due process, excessive, cruel and unusual punishment. What does that mean? Equal protection of the laws. What does that mean? And so Levy's argument is many of the key words in the Constitution are indeed ambiguous. They are not clear. They are not precise. They are vague. And obviously the founders intended it that way. His conclusion then is that if the founders used words like unreasonable, probable cause, due process, excessive, cruel and unusual, equal protection, if they use those words as ambiguous as they are, then it was obviously because they intended future generations would interpret those words and reinterpret the words as their meaning changed in different generations. In other words, Levy argues that the original intent of the founders was to encourage future generations to interpret these vague terms in ways that were most appropriate at the time the decision was being reached. As Levy says, the founders were not dummies. They knew that society would evolve in unforeseeable ways, morally, socially, politically, technologically. And they also knew that this evolution might well bring about unforeseeable applications of the same words. There was no way they could anticipate or foresee what these words were going to mean 100, 200 years out from the time that the Constitution was written. So Levy's conclusion is, and this is an interesting, I think, perspective. His perspective is that true originalism, then, genuinely following the intent of the founders, requires contemporary judges and courts to interpret constitutional language in light of our own, not the original moral and linguistic norms of the period. In other words, these vague words mean something different today than they meant 200 years ago. And Levy's argument is that the founders obviously intended that. They weren't stupid, clearly, and they used ambiguous language. And consequently, because they used ambiguous language, they must have known that those words would have to be interpreted and reinterpreted over and over again as times changed. That, to Levy, is what true originalism then is about. True originalism is not going back to the original meaning of the word at the time the Constitution was written. Levy argues true originalism is the meaning of these ambiguous terms in today's vernacular. He points out that besides originalism and textualism, there is a third way of interpreting the Constitution. He calls it principled pragmatism, the most practical application of a particular clause or a particular phrase in today's world. Principled pragmatism, Levy says that judges should consider not only the constitutional language as those who wrote it interpreted it, but also the constitutional language as we interpret those words today. In a sense, then, what Levy is arguing here is that the idea of a living constitution really is the original intent of the founders. That the founders used ambiguous terms in key places because they knew that future generations would have to redefine those terms as they had meaning then rather than at the original time. The example, and it's an example that I'm quite familiar with, and so many of you probably are too, is the Brown versus Board of Education school integration decision in 1954. You'll recall that segregated schools had been justified in the late 19th century by the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the railroad car decision reached in 1896, which said that the races could be separated based on race, provided the accommodations were separate but equal. In other words, they could be separate as long as they were equal. It was within the framework of the Constitution, the Plessy decision said, to take Black Americans, African Americans, and put them in a different car or at the back of the car, as long as the conditions back there or in the separate car were equal to accommodations that others received. In 1954, the decision in Brown versus Board of Education required the overturning of Plessy. If the court in 1954 had taken the meaning of Plessy versus Ferguson and the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, at the time it was written, which was right after the Civil War in the 1860s, then the court in 1954 would have had to uphold Plessy. In other words, if they had gone back to the original intent of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, they would have had to uphold Plessy versus Ferguson. But the reality was that in 1954, it was clear that African American students were going to schools that were far inferior and were in no way equal to the schools that white youngsters attended. The only way to address that wrong, the only way to guarantee equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment was not to uphold Plessy versus Ferguson, but to strike it down. And that's what they did. In other words, that is a classic example of what Ken Levy calls practical pragmatism. So the question remains then, when conservatives use the term today, when Neil Gorsuch uses the term originalism and textualism, what are they talking about? They're talking about words that justify their own conservative political philosophy. They aren't talking about legal meaning at all. As Ken Levy argues, true originalism would require just the opposite of what they believe politically. So they don't go there. Very, very interesting interpretation of originalism. His idea of what he called principled pragmatism, then, is his justification for the idea of a living constitution. I found this particular document, this particular article, to be quite revealing. As you know, the reason that I support the living, and we've talked about this before, the reason that I support the idea of a living constitution is because there's too much in the writings of the founders themselves which support that idea. Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention at the time. He was in Europe representing the Continental Congress in France. But Jefferson was in constant contact with James Madison. And they kicked back and forth the meanings of particular words. And it was very clear that Jefferson was well aware that future generations were going to have to alter the meanings of terms as they were understood at that time. And the best example that I've found to support the idea of a living constitution is in the writings of James Madison himself. You'll recall that in 1829, Madison supports the extension of the suffrage to heads of household by pointing out that in 1829, the Constitution is a half century after its original drafting. And what Madison is pointing out is what was true 50 years ago when we wrote and ratified the Constitution has changed. And Madison points out it's very clear now that the demographics of the country are changing rapidly. And that if we don't update the meaning of the Constitution, then it will become irrelevant to the society that we are currently living in. So Madison himself justifies the idea of the living Constitution. He reinforces or validates what Ken Levy calls principled pragmatism. The reason I think this particular issue is relevant, of course, is because these issues are being discussed right now in the Senate confirmation hearings for Neil Gorsuch. In the couple of hours that I listened yesterday, it was on about 10 hours, and I listened to probably 2. But one of the things I picked up on very quickly was the number of times the conversation went back to Madison and those who voted for and helped ratify the Constitution of the United States. So I think that the Gorsuch hearings are powerful in giving us insights into the differences in today's world between conservatives and liberals as they play themselves out in assigning or nominating a new member, confirming a new member of the United States Supreme Court. So I think all of this is quite relevant. I hope that you will agree. I'd like to move into a second topic. We have 30 minutes left in this, our first hour of our program today. I'd like to reserve the final hour for healthcare if we get there. I'd like to share with you an article that I've been sitting on now for several days. This article appeared on the 16th of March, which is almost a week ago. The author of the article is a novelist, Hisham Matar, M-A-T-A-R. First name Hisham, H-I-S-H-A-M. Hisham Matar. The title of this article, quote, "Books can take you places Donald Trump doesn't want you to go," unquote. The title of that article drew me to it for obvious reasons. But until I read it, I really had no idea where this article was going to take me. I found this to be one of those rare times when you read something and are absolutely enthralled with what you learn from it. I hope that you will agree. In order to do justice to the author, I want to quote extensively from the author's own language because of the nature of what he says about literature, about books. He said, like a lot of people, he was always encouraged to read books, to pick up a book. And he was told, like many of us have been, the reason you need to read is that so you can know the world. And author Matar indeed validates that statement. He points out that because of the books we've read, the books he's read, he said it's taken me to different countries, different states of mind, social conditions, historical epochs. Basically, books have taken me to situations that I never dreamed I'd ever be in. So all of that is true. It's a way to know the world. They've shown me horror and beauty. Here's where this article begins to become relevant, though. He says the most significant, the most magical moments in reading occur not when I come across something that I didn't know, but rather when I come across something that helps me better understand myself. When I read a sentence that perfectly describes something I've known or felt all along. When I experience that in a book, he says, I'm reminded that I'm really not all that different from anybody else. In other words, what this author is saying about literature, about reading books, is that it is a way to better understand ourselves. But more specifically, it's a way to better understand how we are like other people, no matter where they are. His message then is that this is what gives us insight into what it means to be human, what it means to be a human being. It links us to the universal, to what all people have in common, and gives us a way to connect ourselves to that. The more it happens, the more we become appreciative of the fact that we are human and that all of us are part of something bigger than ourselves. I'm reminded here of Emerson's essay on the Oversoul. The idea that all of us are part of a human soul that defines mankind. And the meaning of life is our efforts to try to reconnect to the universal. He says, perhaps that is really the secret motive behind every library. To stumble upon ourselves in the lives and lands and tongues of others. The more foreign the setting, the more poignant the event seems. For a strange thing happens. A distance widens, and then it is crossed. In other words, the more you read about distant places and distant peoples, the more you find a way to connect with those that, at least on the surface, don't seem to have any connection to you at all. You begin to appreciate the fact that no matter how far away you go, how different the people are that you come into contact with in literature, when you get down to it, they have an awful lot in common with you. Or to put it another way, you have more in common with them than you ever dreamed. How many times, he says, in ways that didn't even seem to require my consent, did I suddenly in my own bed find myself to be Russian or French or Japanese. I've been a peasant. I've been an aristocrat. I've been a woman. I've been a man. I've been free. I've been not free. I've been disabled. I've been old. I've been loved. I've been hated. Think of that litany of experiences that literature has opened to all of us. All great art allows us to do this, to gain a glimpse across the limits of our own self. These are not just experiments in virtual reality, he says. These are moments of genuine expansion, human expansion. They are at the heart of our humanity. We couldn't have gotten where we are without them. It's literature, books, that enable us to connect with the world in which we all live together. Just as a river leads to the sea, he says, the particular in good literature always flows to the universal. From the particular to the universal. From the river to the sea, to the ocean. He quotes the author of the book House of Hunger by the Zimbabwean writer Dambudzo Marachera, who says the following: if you are a writer for a specific nation or a specific race, then he had no use for you. What he was resisting was narrow provincialism, the sort of identitarianism that has invaded our academies, our classrooms, our public discourse, in which people see individual life, first and foremost, as representative of a particular racial, religious, or cultural category. In other words, when we try to go from the universal to the particular, we narrow ourselves. We become provincial. We cease to explore the universe. Instead, we try to bring the universe into our world and redefine it in such a way that it's something we can understand and manage. But in reality, it ceases to be the world. It ceases to be universal. What Marachera calls a courageous universalism is at the heart of how literature, good literature, works. Consequently, it is central to our resistance to the narrow visions of populists who are trying to conduct what we've called here at the Virtual Center identity politics, where we've tended or tried to stereotype particular groups, particular races, particular nationalities. One of the advertisements we see frequently on television is this service that you can buy into, which allows you to trace your own DNA and find out exactly who you are and what your makeup is. You've probably seen the commercials where somebody said, I found out that I was 16% Native American, or something like that. In other words, we're seeking to particularize ourselves rather than make ourselves more universal. We're heading in the wrong direction. That, this particular author, Matar, says, is contrary to what good literature can and should be doing for us. He says, nothing we read can import new or foreign feelings that we don't in one form or another already possess. Let me repeat that. Nothing that we read can import new or foreign feelings that we don't in one form or another already possess. And he quotes Marcel Proust. Every reader is actually the reader of himself, he says in his Time Regained. Remember Plato in his allegory of the cave. At the end of the allegory, when Plato addresses the issue of teachers, educators, and he basically says, true knowledge is within us all already. The true educator is the person that can bring it out of us and give us the opportunity to recognize it and understand it, to know what we already know. But Plato says education is never the introduction of things we don't know. Rather, it's the appreciation of things we already do know. And it's literature that enables us to do that. Consequently, he's very concerned about the provincialism, the narrowness, what we call identity politics, where we increasingly try to identify ourselves and identify each other by what makes us different from rather than like other people. The nature of understanding humanity, of understanding what it means to be human, is related to moving from the particular to the universal, not the other way around. His conclusion: this is why literature is the greatest argument for the universalist instinct. This is why literature is intransigent about its own liberty. It refuses to be enrolled, regardless of how noble or urgent the project. Literature cannot be governed or dictated to. By instinct, it is interested in conflicting empathies, in men and women who are running into their own hearts, in doubt and contradictions, which is why, without even intending to, like a moon to the night, it disrupts the totalitarian narrative. What literature reveals about our human nature is central to the quality of our conversation in today's world. He now turns to Donald Trump. And his position is doubt and contradictions are not tolerated in Mr. Trump's life. But he says, of course, they're there, as they are in every life, no matter how deeply they are concealed. You can see it in the tragic air that never leaves him, the rhythm of his steps, the lines sculpted into his face, the rigidity of his neck as he signs those executive orders. Yes, doubt must be there, because he's not only intolerant of complexity, he fears it. He must control. He must define. He can never leave anything to chance or to ambiguity. He seeks to control and redefine the universal. That's the basis of totalitarianism. It's the basis of total control. What false vigor, then, he says, must demonizing and excluding millions of innocent people based on their race and their religion inspire? This is the only way to understand the travel ban, the efforts to keep out refugees, to keep out Muslims under the guise of protecting the nation's security. What is really happening here, this author says, is that Mr. Trump has a limited interpretation of himself and therefore of humanity. Like the censor of good literature, his actions damage the fiber of our society, because in the long run, the real danger falls to the one doing the excluding rather than the ones being excluded. The more we seek to separate ourselves from people who are different, the more we contribute to our own provincialism. We do damage to our own universality. We do damage to our ability to understand the nature of human beings, the nature of humanity itself. It's our interactions with those who are different, with those who come from different cultures, different places, different religions, different nations, different climates, that give us the opportunity to learn from them and to appreciate not only their own humanity, but more importantly, ours. The nature of totalitarianism, then, must be to censor literature, to keep out those differences, those points of view that are different. Jefferson's opposition, if you remember, in 1816, to the United States Senate's efforts to ban foreign books in order to protect American youngsters by shielding them from dangerous foreign ideas. That's not education. It's exactly the opposite. It's an effort to infantilize, to keep people ignorant and unaware of the world around them and the value of humanity. This particular article appears in the New York Times on March 16th, 6 days ago. The author, Hisham Matar, M-A-T-A-R. The title, Books Can Take You Places Donald Trump Doesn't Want You to Go. It's an intriguing title. But when you really read this article, you can begin to appreciate it and understand it. I think that this article contributes in a big way to our overall effort to understand the nature of the political world we're currently living in. What is it that motivated those who are the biggest advocates of Trumpism? Those who more than anything else are responsible for the election of Donald Trump. His core constituents, those who are on his Twitter account, those with whom he regularly communicates his positions on issues almost on a daily basis. Who are they? Why did they support him? What is there about him that attracted them, that continues to attract them? It's his efforts to keep out and control change, to keep out foreigners, to keep out foreign ideas, to promote America first, to take care of ourselves before we worry about anybody else. It is, in effect, to deny our own humanity. It is to deny the universality of the human race. It is to deny the realities of globalism, of the complexity that is the world we all live in. It breeds misunderstanding and confusion and distrust. It does not support or strengthen understanding, improve communication, and concern one human for another. In other words, literature contradicts everything that Trumpism stands for. I think the article is extremely insightful and informative for that reason. We're about 3 minutes before the top of the hour, so I think we've reached a good place to stop and pause and take our 5-minute break and give people an opportunity to get up and stretch and walk around and get a soft drink or a cup of coffee or whatever. So I think we'll do that. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. Then we'll come right back and we'll get into our second hour. And the topic of our second hour will be healthcare. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour of today's program on the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Wednesday. It is the 22nd day of March in the year 2017. If you are just joining us, welcome to our program. Our major topic this hour will be healthcare, will be the ongoing debate over healthcare. And there's one particular article that I picked up some time ago that I want to share with you, and I'll get into it in a moment. If you are at all interested in what we talked about in our first hour, you may remember that in our first half of our first hour, the first 30 minutes of our program, we talked about an article related to the issues of textualism and originalism in interpreting the Constitution. And of course, this is linked directly to the testimony, the confirmation hearings of Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court vacancy left with the death of Antonin Scalia. In the second half of our first hour, we looked at an article that appeared in the New York Times just short of a week ago on the issues of books, literature, and the extent to which they contradict the world as defined by Donald Trump. What we began to understand then is the extent to which literature takes us in directions that the priorities of the world envisioned by Donald Trump doesn't want us to head in, doesn't want us to go in. So basically, it deals with the basic contradictions between provincialism and the narrowness of the world as Donald Trump defines it, versus the expansiveness and the universality of the world in which good literature helps us discover. So, our first hour will be archived. They'll be available to you on whiterosesociety.org as well as on YouTube. And so if you would like to pick up our first hour of today's program, you can do that by looking at the at the podcast or the archived the archived version of today's first hour. This second hour, it seems to me, will be devoted principally to healthcare, which is what we talked about going in. If you have comments, if there are things about our first hour that you really want to weigh in on, then by all means, I invite you to do that. This conversation on healthcare will obviously hold for another day. It would be much more important if we heard from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And as we said numerous times, 4676 translates into Horn, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to email me, communicate with me one-on-one and share your ideas that way, my email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. I also invite you to visit our Facebook page. If you go to the search box at the top of the homepage for Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. There is a posting. In fact, I think the most recent posting on Facebook, on our Facebook page, relates to the healthcare focus that we will have this hour. So we'll be talking about this particular approach to healthcare during this hour. But you can get an article, a posting that I wrote about it on our Facebook page. I will also tell you that the next posting that I put on our Facebook page is going to relate to the originalism, textualism article by Ken Levy that we looked at the beginning in our first half hour of today's program. So if you follow our Facebook page and give me 24 hours or so, I will have a posting on that particular article. I think that particular view, that perspective that Ken Levy shares with us on the idea of the living Constitution, what he called principled pragmatism, is a valuable one. And I'd like to get it in writing and establish it once and for all on our Facebook page. With that, then, let's get into the issue of healthcare. In 1 hour, a little bit less than 1 hour, there's obviously no way that we can resolve all the issues and all the problems associated with healthcare. I think the one thing that we've begun to appreciate, if nothing else, is just how complex this issue is. The fact that Republicans have been screaming for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act throughout both terms of President Obama's presidency. And now that they are in power, they are hard put to come up with an alternative. I think it speaks to the complexities and the contradictions in issues and perspectives associated with coming up with a coming up with a healthcare plan. I've got Facebook on my mind. Coming up with a healthcare plan that would be acceptable to most folks. I want to share with you an article on the issue of healthcare that was written by Anu Partanen. First name A-N-U. Second name P-A-R-T-A-N-E-N. Anu Partanen. Dated March 18th in the New York Times. The title of it, if you go to archives, it's 4 days ago. I believe this article appeared in Sunday's Review, Sunday's opinion section of the New York Times. It's dated the 18th, which was Saturday, I believe. The title of Partanen's article is, quote, "The Fake Freedom of American Healthcare," unquote. I would focus on her use of the term fake freedom, because there's absolutely no question that a major perspective that is driving the Republican alternative to the Affordable Care Act is an emphasis on patient freedom, on patient responsibility. The implication then is that if we continue to support government-provided, government-managed health care, then what we are doing is subjecting ourselves to faceless bureaucrats who are making decisions that we should be making. That's what American society is about, is the freedom of the individual to make decisions affecting our own lives. That's the emphasis of the Republican plan. That's the major basis for the Republican opposition to Obamacare, to the Affordable Care Act. The focus of most of the Republican opposition over the years, since Obama's first term, since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the critics, the conservative critics of the ACA, of the Affordable Care Act, have focused on the mandates that require all citizens to carry health insurance or to pay a penalty if they don't. Mandates that require employers who employ at least 50 people to provide health insurance for their employees, for their full-time employees. I think the way the law is written is all employees who work at least 30 hours a week. So the number of stories we've heard about employers who cut their employees back to 29.5 hours a week so that they don't fall under the penalty provisions of the Affordable Care Act. Basically, then, the critics argue that the Obama approach to health care is tainted by these government mandates which interfere with the individual freedom of Americans to select the plan, the insurance plan, the coverage which best suits them. And so the major justification, the major argument for the Republican plan is the freedom of individual patients, citizens, to choose. And to be responsible for their own selections, their own choices. The fact of the matter is, as we know, The Congressional Budget Office issued its report, which said that as many as 24 million people will lose health care coverage over the next decade if the Republican plan is passed. Because the mandates to carry health insurance will be gone. There will be a penalty for those who have health care and allow it to lapse. There'll be a penalty to get it back. But as far as the mandates, which require young people who for the most part are healthy and won't use health care to carry it, will be gone. As we know, the very nature of insurance is based on the principle of sharing the risk. By requiring everybody to carry health insurance, you are in effect guaranteeing that young people who don't use it, who likely will not use it, are paying into a program to provide health insurance to older people and people who have pre-existing conditions who will use it. In other words, the young generation is being taxed in order to support the health care of the older generation. The thinking being that at some time they will become old, and then working people then will support their health care. This is the very basis of not only the Affordable Care Act, it's the very basis of insurance. Basically, insurance, the profit for insurance companies is principally driven by the people who won't use it. The people who are afraid not to have it just in case. But the likelihood is that they won't use it. But the fact that they carry it means that the insurance companies can provide coverage to people who most likely will use it. That's the basic premise. But as we know, what this is going to mean is that as many as 24 million Americans who currently have insurance, many of them currently receiving Medicaid and were involved in the expansions of Medicaid that made the Affordable Care Act available to them. So that's the very basis of the differences in the plan. To the idea of fake freedom that Anu Pratenin speaks to. Quote, she says, Republican leaders seem unfazed by the fact that 24 million people, according to the Congressional Budget Office, will lose their health care, primarily because of changes in regulations, subsidies, and Medicaid coverage. That would make it too expensive for them to continue to purchase health care. The subsidies that the Republican plan talks about are significantly less than the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. They are age-based subsidies under the Republican plan. What that means is people of a certain age get a certain subsidy. People who are older get a larger subsidy. But the reality is that these subsidies come not even close to fulfilling the costs, the anticipated costs of healthcare. So consequently, it's going to drive many people who currently have it to become people who don't. This article points out that Republican leaders seemed unfazed by this, perhaps because in their own minds, deciding not to have health care because it's too expensive is actually an exercise of individual free will. In other words, part of individual freedom is choosing not to have it. But the question that she raises, and the question that I raise, if you don't have health care because you can't afford it, is that free choice? Republicans suggest that it is. Common sense, to me, suggests that it's not. If you don't have it because you can't buy it, then I would argue that that's not an expression or a reflection of your freedom. That's really the issue. She says, however, that there's an appealing logic to this thinking. The idea behind the Republican plan is that buying health care is like buying anything else. The United States is home to some of the world's best medical schools, doctors, research institutions, and hospitals. And if you have the money for the coverage and the procedures you want, you absolutely can get top-notch health care. This approach might result in extreme inequities. It might be expensive, but definitely it can constitute the best medical treatment in the world anywhere for those who can afford it. Everybody points out we must have the best healthcare system in the world because people from around the world who need healthcare come here to get it. But the fact of the matter is, the only people who can get it are the people who can afford to pay for it. And then she says, such is the cost of freedom. And then she includes a couple of quotations to elaborate on this point. I would ask you to think hard on these particular statements. The first one is House Speaker Paul Ryan. In a tweet, he said the following: freedom is the ability to buy what you want to fit what you need, unquote. Freedom is the ability to buy what you want to fit what you need. In a sense, then, the only people who have freedom when it comes to health care are the people who can afford to buy it. The second quote that I'd ask you to think about is Vice President Mike Pence. And this is what he says: Obamacare will be replaced with something that actually works, bringing freedom and individual responsibility back to American healthcare, unquote. By replacing Obamacare with a new plan that emphasizes freedom and individual responsibility, that will produce a plan more consistent with the American way of life. In effect, then, what they are talking about is a particular kind of freedom. It requires, and I'm quoting here, it requires most Americans to spend not just money, but time and energy, agonizing over the bewildering logistics of coverages and treatments, confusing plans, exorbitant premiums and deductibles, exclusive networks, mysterious tests, outrageous drug prices. More often than not, individual choices are severely restricted by decisions made by employers, insurance companies, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, and other private players. Consequently, the fact is, quote, those interest groups, not the consumer, decide which plans are available, what those plans will cover, which doctors patients can see, and how much their care will cost. So what she is doing here is challenging this idea of freedom. She's pointing out that making individuals go through all of those plans and all those deductibles and all those options, all of them driven by a different price, is an exercise of freedom. Her suggestion is it's exactly the opposite. It's misery. It's high stress misery. And reminder, she said, we're not even talking here about the millions of people who don't earn enough money to buy insurance at all. If you can't afford it, not buying it is hardly a choice. If you don't have the money to afford it, then you don't have any choice at all. The choice has been made by somebody else. She said 8 years ago she moved here from Finland. And she said Finland, like all Nordic nations, is contradictory to what many people believe, a wealthy capitalist economy. Most people will argue that Finland is a socialist economy because it's government-supplied health care. Her point is that Finland's economy is capitalistic. Like all those countries, she says, Finland has invested in a universal taxpayer-funded, publicly managed healthcare system. Finns constantly debate the shortcomings of their system and continually work to improve it. But in Finland, she says, I never worried about where my medical care would come from or whether I could afford it. I paid my taxes. Consequently, if I needed to see a doctor, I had several options. Never for a moment did I worry that I wasn't covered, that I couldn't see a doctor or get medical attention for a particular need. She said in many cases, doctors are provided by employers, are paid for by employers. She said for minor medical matters, I could visit a private physician provided as a perk by my employer. Or I could go to a public clinic closer to my home. If I saw the private doctor, my employer picked up the tab with public subsidies. In other words, government public tax money subsidized the cost to the employer for this. If I went to the public clinic, it might cost me a small copay, usually around $20. But there was never a question as to whether I had health care or not. If I wanted to, she said, I could have easily paid to see a private doctor on my own. again with the help of public subsidies. All of this, she says, works without anyone ever having to sign up or buy health insurance at all. The whole industry, the health insurance industry, is missing. The billions of dollars being generated by insurance companies to provide health care coverage is missing. The revenue generated goes right into the provision of health care, not the purchase of insurance. I never had to worry whether I was covered, she says. All FINs are covered for all essential Medicare automatically, regardless of employment, regardless of income. Republicans, she said, are fond of criticizing this European-style health care. Trump called it catastrophic. Ted Cruz on CNN talked about long delays, how patients in countries with universal government-managed health care get less cure than Americans. In Europe, he said, elderly people facing life-threatening diseases are often placed in palliative care, essentially told that if it's their time to go, it's their time to go. All this is what Ted Cruz says. According to Republican orthodoxy, government always takes away not only people's freedom to choose their doctor, but also the doctor's ability to choose the correct care for the patients. People, critics say, are at the mercy of bureaucrats. Waiting times are long. Quality of care is dismal. And then she asks a question. Are Republicans right about this? And this is data that I want to share, because this is data that I think all of us need to have. She asked the question, are Republicans right about this in their criticisms of European-style health care? Practically every wealthy capitalist democracy in the world, she said, has decided that some form of government-managed universal health care is the most sensible and effective option. The United States, despite claims to the contrary, does not actually outshine other countries in the quality of health care. Let me repeat this. She says, despite claims to the contrary, the United States does not actually outshine other countries in the quality of health care. The best is available here, but only a few people can buy it. In fact, she says, the United States has shorter life expectancy, higher infant mortality, fewer doctors per capita than most developed countries. When it comes to outcomes for certain illnesses, including cancer, the United States has some of the best survival rates in the world. But it's about equal, barely ahead, maybe even slightly behind survival rates in other developing countries. In breast cancer survival, for example, the United States comes in second after Sweden. Third best is Norway. Fourth is Finland. All three of these countries have universal government-run healthcare systems. Sweden is first, Norway is third, Finland is fourth, and the U.S. is second in terms of breast cancer. For colorectal cancer, the 5-year survival rate after diagnosis in the United States places it 9th in overall international statistics, ahead of the United States in survival rates for colorectal cancer are South Korea, Israel, Australia, Sweden, and Finland, all with some form of government-managed universal health care. When it comes to cervical cancer, American women are at a distinct disadvantage. The United States comes in 22nd in terms of survival rates for cervical cancer. Meanwhile, life expectancy at age 65 is higher in 24 other developed countries than it is here, including Canada, Britain, most European nations. Basically, then, what this data does is call into question the claims of Republicans that healthcare based on individual freedom and individual responsibility rather than government bureaucrats is the best healthcare system in the world. In a lot of specific areas, that's not true, despite the claims. The reality, however, is something different. When you talk about bureaucracy, she says, consider American doctors, who are the ones that complain all the times about the amount of time they spend on bureaucratic administrative paperwork related to insurance companies and claims. Go to your physician, talk to the person at the front desk about how much time is spent dealing with insurance companies, trying to get certain medical procedures covered under the particular insurance plan that you have. So the question is, are even our doctors free if they're saddled with this kind of bureaucratic nightmare of administrative procedures? The fact is, she says, Americans spend far more money on health care than any other country by a wide margin. Consequently, it's Americans who really are getting the raw deal. We pay more, but we don't get better results. The reality is that buying health care is not like buying another consumer product. The point of universal coverage, she says, is to pool risk for the maximum benefit of the individual when he or she needs care. The point of having government manage this complicated service is not to take freedom away from the individuals. Rather, it's just the opposite, to give people more freedom. Arranging health care is overwhelming. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of knowledge and expertise. Having specialized people do it, the negotiating, the regulating, perhaps even providing for the health care itself, is much more efficient than asking everybody to do it by themselves. Asking people to navigate the ever-changing maze of plans, prices, scarcity of appointments available with good doctors creates a constant state of stress. In government-provided health care plans, that stress is missing. You're always covered, whatever the medical problem. You never have to worry about it. So the question she asks is the freedom of knowing that none of it will bankrupt you. That's the kind of freedom I had in Finland. Basically, then, what this particular article is talking about is an approach to healthcare that is based on the idea that individual people are not qualified to make the kinds of intricate decisions that selecting plans and options and specific coverages requires. Checking to see whether a particular prescription is covered by your particular provider. Shopping for health care and doing it well almost makes it a full-time job. Consequently, her title of Fake Freedom. On Facebook, when I recommended this particular article on Facebook this past weekend, I made the point that this is a must-read for people who are trying to understand healthcare, as well as people who don't think they can possibly figure it out, so they don't even worry about it. I put on Facebook that I thought that this was the most informative, easiest to understand essay on the subject that I've read. This is a comparison of the two kinds of health care from someone who has experienced both. It focuses on the idea of freedom, more specifically, what the author refers to as fake freedom. This is the principle, this issue of freedom is the principal excuse of those who challenge Obamacare, because they claim it allows bureaucrats, faceless bureaucrats, to make decisions that individual citizens ought to be making, like what they need or don't need for coverage, or getting the doctor they want, or securing the kind of care they need when they need it. And then I quoted the paragraph from the article where she said there's an appealing logic to this kind of Republican thinking. The idea is that buying health care is like buying anything else. The conclusion she reaches in the end of this article is it's not. It's not a commodity. We treat it like a commodity. We make it a commodity. But it's not a commodity. It requires too much knowledge and too much expertise. It's too complicated to function as a commodity. Rather, what we need are specialists who know the game and can make recommendations for us in order to remove that stress from us, from ourselves. The United States is home to some of the world's best medical schools, doctors, research institutions, and hospitals. And if you've got the money for the coverage and the procedures you want, you absolutely can get top-notch care. It might result in extreme inequalities. It might be expensive, but it definitely will get you the best medical treatment available anywhere. That's the cost of this freedom. If you can buy it, you can get the best. But if you can't buy it, can you still claim that it's your choice, that you are free? And then I quoted the Paul Ryan and the Mike Pence quotes about freedom being the ability to buy what you want, to fit what you need, etc. And I made special focus. I tried to make a special point of this issue of freedom and individual responsibility. What I'm suggesting here, this is interpretive. What I'm suggesting here is that if you look at these claims of freedom and personal responsibility, excuse me, and if you feel, as I do, that this is really the basis of the Republican plan, the Republican approach to health care, then basically the issue is not mandates. That's the emphasis. criticism of the mandates required in the Affordable Care Act under Obamacare. But when you think about it and you read these quotes, the issue is not the mandates. The issue is that health care is a commodity which belongs to the people who have earned it. It is a right that people earn. It comes with success. By definition, giving health care to people who haven't earned it violates the commitment to freedom and individual responsibility that is the basis of the Republican position. Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, in an interview on CNN this past Sunday, made exactly this point. I sat there and listened to him say this. Medicaid, he said, is a welfare program. It's for the disabled, the infirm, the elderly, young children. For them, it's appropriate and necessary. We should provide it. But able-bodied people don't belong on Medicaid. They need to get a job. That's exactly what Tom Cotton said. The reason he's committing to voting against the House Republican plan is because it doesn't go far enough in its reliance on individual freedom and responsibility. In essence, what he's saying is that health care is a commodity, and only the people who have earned it have the right to it. This is exactly what I wrote on Facebook. Taking care of sick people is not what this debate is about, it seems. Earning a right to them is the key ingredient to plans that these folks will support. What really irritates Republicans about Obamacare is not so much the mandates, even though that's what they emphasize. But what bothers them is that so many are getting expensive health care that haven't earned it, that don't have a right to it. In effect, what these folks are saying is, if they're not working, why do they need to be healthy? The purpose of health care is to get you healthy so that you can go back to work and contribute to and continue to contribute. If you're not working and you're not contributing, then you don't need health care, especially health care that I'm being asked to pay for. It's one thing for me to use my tax money to pay for the health care for children and elderly people and the disabled. They don't have any other means to get it. But able-bodied people need to earn it. And if they don't, then they don't have a right to it. I would suggest to you that if this argument makes sense to you, it does to me. If it makes sense to you, then what we're saying is that this debate isn't about health care at all. It's about who should have it and who shouldn't. It's about credibility. It's about fairness. To Republicans, fairness in healthcare means that those who have worked for it and can afford it have a right to it. Those who haven't don't. That's not a debate about health care, about the best way to provide it. It's not about taking care of sick people at all. It's about ideology. It's linked more directly to the free market idea of capitalism than it is health care. The thinking of Mike Pence, Paul Ryan, Tom Cotton, and some of the other leading spokesmen of the Republican forces in both the House and the Senate suggests that this is a debate about ideology. It's a debate about the free enterprise system. It's the debate about hard work. It's a debate about earning the right to the benefits of living in this kind of a society. The value of this article, I believe, comes with the detail that she provides on the coverage, the universal coverage in Finland and elsewhere, as well as the most frequent criticisms of European-style healthcare and the claims that the American healthcare system is the best in the world. Clearly, the reason they believe it's the best in the world is because if you can buy it, you can buy the best. But this system is not driven by the need to cover everybody. When Bernie Sanders refers to healthcare as a human right, this runs totally counter to Republican ideology. It's exactly the opposite to what they believe. Their job, their challenge, is to provide health care coverage to as many people as possible, but to make sure that people have to earn it, that you don't give it away. The thinking being that if you give it away, its value is cheapened. What makes our healthcare system the best system in the world is that everybody doesn't have it. Everybody can't get it. The people that deserve it can, but the people who haven't earned it cannot. To them, that's what makes this system the best healthcare system in the world. It's a system that is consistent with their view of free enterprise capitalism and the emphasis on individual freedom and self-initiative, individual responsibility. Their thinking is that if government provides it, if taxpayers pay for it, if you're getting something that you haven't earned, then you don't appreciate it. So they would take serious issue with Bernie Sanders' claim that health care is a human right. The fact of the matter is then that as we kind of wrap this up, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes to go before we have to close. It seems to me that one of the things that becomes very clear is that there are a number of different and contradictory competing agendas here. People aren't communicating with each other. They're not talking to each other. They're talking past each other. And I think part of the reason is because they're not all talking about the same thing. The Republican plan, the Republican approach is driven by the idea that in order to be high quality, it must be supplied by the free market. It must be market driven, which means it must be profit driven, which means that everybody doesn't get it equally, which means that those people who have earned the right to the best can get the best. But those people who haven't earned that right should not get it. That, I would argue, is the principal issue behind this debate. It's the issue behind President Trump's America First campaign. It's the issue behind his rejection of international global trading organizations like NAFTA and TPP and all the rest of them. It's the idea that in a world driven by negotiation, by making deals, by compromise, by competition, then that each nation ought to basically live with plans that it itself negotiates, rather than a plan which all the nations together create.
Are you there, Bill? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. All right, thank you. I think we're back on. It's actually 2 minutes before the top of the hour. So by getting me back on, then all we have to do is have the time to say thank you and extend to you best wishes for a great evening and a wonderful weekend. I think we're going to I think finally spring is going to spring, if that makes sense. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. I want to thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center and of the Head On Radio Network. For Bob Kincaid and Agnes and the folks at the Head On Radio Network, for myself, thank you very much for your continued support and your patience. I hope that the 2 hours we spent together today were somewhat valuable and informative for you. They were for me. Thank you so very, very much. Be kind to each other. We'll see you all on Monday, and thank you.